Hello, and welcome to the second lecture in early U.S. history. I'm John Brown, and today we're going to be covering a period of migration to the New World from Europe and from Africa. We're going to be focusing mostly on English settlement, although we'll discuss some French and Spanish to some extent too, and we'll be discussing obviously the contact and conflict with Native Americans who were already in North America. To give us some context and give us some background on what happened and why we suddenly start seeing a wave of migration from England. Remember, South and Central America at this time were mostly controlled by the Spanish, and there had been only limited settlement in the territory that's now the United States and Canada, but that's going to change beginning in the late 1500s and especially into the 1600s. Some things to keep in mind is that we have a new monarch in England now. Henry VIII dies and is succeeded by Elizabeth I, and Elizabeth I is eager to strengthen the English Empire, which is behind the ball in the empire game. Remember, Spain is dominating much of the New World right now, so Elizabeth wants to change that. She vows to catch up. Towards this end, she encourages English privateers, most famously Francis Drake, to attack Spanish ships. What is a privateer, you ask? Well, basically, it's a legal pirate. A privateer steals and plunders on behalf of a crown. They are granted a license by that crown, so they technically operate within the law, whereas a pirate steals and plunders on their own behalf. England's main objectives during this time period under Elizabeth I were to find the Northwest Passage. This is the theoretical ocean passage north of Canada, which you could sail across and reach Asia. Such a passage did not exist because frozen over. The other objective is going to be to, as they put it, singe the King of Spain's beard. In other words, put Spain in their place, reestablish English dominance. Towards this end, England establishes their first colony in North America, and that is going to be Roanoke Colony. And you may have heard of this. It's kind of famous as the Lost Colony of Roanoke. Sir Walter Raleigh obtained a charter for a new colony called Virginia. It was named Virginia after the Virgin Queen Elizabeth I. And Roanoke Colony was the first colony established in this new colony. This was now in North Carolina. At the time, it was part of Virginia. And it was founded as a base of anti-Spanish privateers. There were actually two waves of settlers. The first wave arrived in the early 1580s, but they left in 1585 and abandoned the colony. The colony was reestablished, though, in 1587. And it was here that Virginia Dare was born, and she's sort of a folk hero, mythological almost character in American history now. She's the first English child born in the New World. Obviously, there were Native Americans already in the area, and relations with them at first were pretty good, although they deteriorated over time. In 1588, some of the colonists left to go back to England to get supplies, but when they arrived in England, they found themselves in the middle of the war with Spain, and as a result of that, their ship was commandeered, and they were not able to return to Roanoke until 1590. And when they returned in 1590, they found the colony had been abandoned, and the only clue as to what happened to the colonists was the word Croatoan was carved on a post. When they left, the settlers had been told to carve a cross on the post if there was any kind of trouble. There was no cross carved, only the word Croatoan, which referred to the local Native American tribe in the area on Croatoan Island. And there was no signs of any kind of struggle in the colony, so they were not, apparently there was no conflict there. One of the members of the party that went back to England wanted to go to Croatoan Island, but it was too late in the year weather was getting bad, so the captain of the ship took him to the Indies. He spent the rest of his life trying to organize an expedition to Croatoan Island to find out what happened, but he was never able to. It's worth noting that Virginia Dare was his granddaughter, so he lost some of his family in this. And to this day, nobody really knows what happened. The colonist I mentioned, by the way, his name was John White, and the guilt from this haunted him for the rest of his life. We don't really know what happened. Our best guess is probably the colonists merged with the Native Americans in the region. 100 years later, there were rumors of and reports of Native Americans with blonde hair and blue eyes in the region with names similar to those of some of the Roanoke settlers. So that's our best guess as to what happened. But reality is we don't know. Maybe someday we'll find out through DNA testing or something, but ultimately their fate remains a mystery. Not saying it was aliens, but it wasn't aliens. All right, so Roanoke fails because it disappears. Elizabeth I is succeeded in 1603 by James I, and he turns out to be pursue a less aggressive foreign policy towards Spain. He actually signs a truce with Spain, attempts to form a colony in Maine, what's now Maine, but this fails, but does succeed in establishing a colony at Jamestown in 1607. And Jamestown becomes the first successful English colony in what's now the United States. Now, the Jamestown was not the English colony at Jamestown was not the first attempted in the region. The Spanish had actually established a mission there with the assistance of a local Native American whom they called Don Luis, who was a Native American who converted to Catholicism and spent 9 years with the Spanish. However, he abandoned the mission and returned to his people. Later on, his people came into conflict with the Spanish and killed all the settlers except for a young boy whom they spared, who was able to return to Spain and tell the tale. When Jamestown was established by the English, it was similar to Roanoke, a colony, to serve as a haven for privateers. Now, the Spanish, as you know, controlled most of Central and South America, and they were mining lots and lots of gold from those areas. And of course, these were the days before steam. Ships were still powered by wind, so they had to follow the ocean currents. And the ocean current back to Europe took them along the coast of South America, along the coast of North America, right past Jamestown. And you could see Spanish ships go by from the beach there at Jamestown, and you could tell they were full of gold because they were weighed down to the point they were really low in the water. So the English had a brilliant idea. They decided, let's let the Spanish go to South America, deal with the diseases there, deal with the mosquitoes, deal with hostile Native Americans, deal with the hard work of mining, deal with loading up their ships. We'll hang out here in what's now Virginia, and when one of these ships goes by, we'll attack it, take the gold, and send it back. Brilliant idea. The ethics might be a little questionable, but whatever. The colonists were sold on coming here. It was pitched from England. The idea of the colony in Jamestown was pitched as almost this new Eden, almost a utopia, virgin land, never been plowed before, fertile land, everything's here for the taking. Yeah, you probably know it didn't really work out quite that way. It began with broken dreams. Many of the colonists were poorly disciplined, unable to motivate themselves to work. They, as some people would say later, literally would not work for food. Probably what was going on here was depression. If you've ever suffered from depression, you could probably relate. It's very, very difficult to motivate, almost impossible to motivate yourself to do anything. They were sold a bill of goods to come here, and then once they arrive here, they see many of their friends starve to death and die. A lot of people just resigned to their fate. The settlers depended on the local Native Americans, the Powhatan, for support. The Powhatan gave them corn for a time, but over time, as you would imagine, they got sick of having to give basically handouts to these English settlers, so they stopped. The colony enlisted the help of John Smith to lead a party in an attempt to seize corn from them. Smith ultimately is captured by the Powhatans and was about to be executed until Chief Powhatan's daughter intervened on his behalf and saved him. His daughter, of course, being Pocahontas. If you've seen the Disney movie, you know this, but Pocahontas is not much of anything like how she was portrayed by Disney. She would have been about 10 years old this time, so it's highly unlikely, and hopefully there was no romance between her and Smith. Whether or not this actually happened is even questionable. It wasn't until years later that Smith would write down an account of this, and Smith was well known to embellish stories, so he may have exaggerated and made it a much more poetic than it actually was. Smith was kind of a self-serving, boastful, but he was an effective manager. He was very dictatorial. He was given control of a Jamestown colony, and he was able to prevent it from failing. He did this through basically ruling it as a dictator. Do what I say. Some people respond well to that. Some people don't. So he was a polarizing figure. Some colonists loved him. Some hated him. The colony sort of barely held on and began with about 600 settlers. Only 50 of them survived. So you're looking at a death rate of about 90%. Most of them starved to death, especially during the first winter, what they called the starving time. Some of the colonists ran away to try to join the local Native Americans. Those who did survive, many of them were forced to resort to cannibalism to live. So this was a pretty hellish, horrific place to be at this time. Ultimately, though, Smith does manage to save it, and a new wave of settlers eventually arrive, and the colony succeeds based on a cash crop, which we'll get to in a little bit. All right, so the Powhatans, who had initially been friendly with Jamestown settlers, but after probably being taken advantage of by the settlers, and also seeing more and more settlers arriving and seeing the writing on the wall there, hostilities began to increase, and this came to a head when they refused to submit to the authority of the Virginia governor. Of course, from the Powhatan perspective, we've lived here for hundreds of years. Now suddenly these people from across the ocean show up and set up shop and create this government that they expect us to live under. Dream on, right? But of course the English expected them to do it, and this ultimately led to the First Anglo-Powhatan War, which went from 1610 to 1614. There was a number of skirmishes ensued between the leader of Jamestown at this time, a guy named Lord de la Warr, who was much more harsh even than John Smith had been towards the Native Americans, and demanded that they submit to his authority. Ultimately, the war ended when Pocahontas was captured by the English, and she agreed to convert to Christianity, and she married a planter by the name of John Rolfe, and they had a son who was one of the first half English, half Native Americans. Pocahontas' story has kind of a sad ending. She later went on a tour to London where she died there of some disease at the age of 19. So she probably didn't even live to be as old as she was portrayed to be in the Disney movie. The war, though, between the Powhatan ended, but there will be two more to come. Cash crop that saves Virginia ultimately is tobacco. As I said, the colony struggled greatly in early years. It came very close to failure several times. But there was a local crop that grows very well in the area, and that was tobacco. And of course, tobacco, being highly addictive, finds a huge market in Europe, and demand quickly grows there. And this results in Virginia becoming a very profitable colony for the English. And tobacco becomes the main export, the main cash crop of the colony. So tobacco ultimately saves Virginia colony. Talk about government in Virginia. There had been military rule until 1619. Virginia Company had ended, which was the corporation that colony was established under was ended. The military rule was ended in 1619, and a new assembly was established. And this assembly was elected by the inhabitants of the colony. The inhabitants, of course, meant planters, rich men who owned property, but nonetheless they got to vote. So it was, in a sense, self-government. So this is an example of one of the first self-governments in the colonies that would become the United States. And this assembly is the first representative legislature in North America. So step forward, right? Also in the same year, the first slaves arrive in Virginia, also in 1619. So you sort of see two contradictory things happening in the same year. One, you get representative government for the first time, but two, you also get slavery at the same time. So these two things obviously are going to conflict with each other. And over the next 250 years or so, this tension is only going to increase. Slavery, if you look at it from like a theological perspective, slavery is almost the original sin of the United States. What I think life was like in Virginia colony, in short, it sucked. It was pretty brutal, mass starvation, cannibalism. Majority of the settlers between 1618 and 1622 died within 3 years. Salt poisoning, malnutrition, typhus were the biggest killers. Lots of settlers who came as indentured servants. What's an indentured servant? If you were poor, you probably couldn't afford fare to come to the New World. So towards that end, you would sell your labor. In other words, you would find somebody who would agree to sponsor you to pay for your voyage over here. And then to pay that off, you would agree to work for free for that person for a term, usually 4 to 7 years. These were indentured servants. Indentured servants is how many of the early settlers came. Eventually, they're going to be phased out, though, in favor of slaves. All right, moving farther north into New England, I'm sure you've heard the story of the Mayflower. 1620, arrived at Plymouth Rock, sailed from England. And before coming to, of course, you probably know who was on the Mayflower? Pilgrims. About half of the passengers aboard the Mayflower were pilgrims. And before coming to America, the Pilgrims, who religiously had been Puritans, who we talked about in the last class, had tried living in the Netherlands. The Puritans felt they had been persecuted in England. So they went to the Netherlands. The Netherlands at the time was one of the only places in the world where freedom of religion existed. So they went there, hopes of freedom of religion, and they got freedom of religion. They were able to worship as they pleased. The problem was they probably got too much freedom for their taste, because Netherlands, like then as now, was a very libertine society. Things like gambling, dancing, prostitution were all openly allowed and tolerated. And of course, the Puritans, being super strict religious folk, did not appreciate that at all. They felt like they had discovered the new Sodom and Gomorrah or something, so they didn't want to live there. So they then decide to come to the New World. They set sail on the Mayflower, and they arrive at Plymouth Rock, maybe, in November of 1620. You can go to Plymouth now and see Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock is actually not mentioned in any documents until over 100 years after the Pilgrims landed. So we don't know for sure if they landed there, but tradition says that they did. Pilgrims, as we view religious people today, pilgrims would seem to us like a cult. They believe themselves to be saints, and they believe the end of the world was at hand. When they had the option of the chance to hire John Smith to be their leader, which may have been a mistake given that how experienced he was in the New World and how he had saved Virginia. On the other hand, it may have also been the right call, because he probably wouldn't have gotten along well with the Puritans as sort of the rogue and whatnot. The Pilgrims much more conservative. When the Pilgrims arrived, though, at Plymouth, they were greeted by a Native American named Squanto, who spoke fluent English, who welcomed them. And this is one of the great coincidences of American history, or maybe more. Squanto had been a Patuxet Indian. In 1614, he had been captured by the English and held as a slave. And during that time, he had learned English. He'd eventually gotten his freedom and returned to Massachusetts in 1619. But when he arrived back home, he found his tribe had been completely wiped out by an epidemic, probably smallpox. So he was all by himself until 1620 when the Pilgrims arrived. So he was probably at that point happy to have some company. And Squanto ends up being a key factor in why Plymouth Colony succeeds. He shows them how to grow corn. He also serves as an ally to the Pilgrims, works as an ambassador on their behalf, represents them to other tribes, serves as an interpreter between them and other Native Americans. Probably without his efforts, the Pilgrims would have had a lot more trouble with Native Americans in the region. May have fought a war, maybe been destroyed. Something to mention about the Pilgrims before they arrived, they signed the Mayflower Compact. This was a compact signed by all males aboard the Mayflower, which created a civil body politic. Why is this important? Every male member of the on board the Mayflower signed this. It was an agreement on how they should be governed. It's considered one of the key documents. It's sort of an example of government based on consent of the governed. All right, so what do you think life was like in Plymouth in the early 1620s? The answer is pretty brutal. Not as bad as Jamestown, though, whereas in Jamestown you had a death rate of 90%. In Plymouth, it's only about 50%. Only about 50%. They survived, though, because the climate there was a little better, fewer diseases. Also, Native Americans, particularly Squanto, provided support for them. At first, they had good relations with the Native Americans, but over time they worsened. Plymouth ultimately succeeded. Slowly but steadily, it became successful and profitable, but this was through trade with Native Americans. At the end of the day, Plymouth in the 1620s was a really tiny colony, an obscure corner of the world, which served as an outpost for Puritan dissenters. All right, so 1600s, biggest changes happen in North America. Europeans and Africans arrive in huge numbers in the New World, and this completely changes North America forever. Whereas most settlers before had gone to Central and South America, now we're seeing more and more coming to North America. Why did Europeans come? Economic opportunity was the biggest reason. They came, land is cheap. They wanted to get in on the tobacco boom, or they wanted to trade with Native Americans. Or second big reason was religious freedom. A lot of religious conflict back in England, and so dissenters, people like the Puritans, also Catholics and Quakers and other groups are going to come to North America too, where they can practice their religion freely. Obviously, Europeans came voluntarily. Africans were forced to come as slaves. The big losers from these developments are obviously going to be Native Americans. Over 1 million Native Americans died as a result of this. Most of them through diseases and epidemics. This transformation leads to 4 distinct regions in what's now the United States appearing: New England, the Chesapeake region, Carolina, and the Middle Colonies. Talk about Chesapeake Bay first. As you can see, it's the land which now comprises Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, a little bit of maybe North Carolina and New Jersey too. Mostly it's going to be centered in modern Virginia and Maryland, though. These were the first colonies in North America to prosper. And they did this almost entirely because of tobacco. There was a big boom here because of tobacco, which saw huge bursts of migration from England to these colonies. Everybody who wanted to get rich quick or make a buck came here looking to get in on the tobacco boom. Of course, society was unequal and unstable. Most colonists who came here found life to be brutal, miserable. Only a small minority became wealthy because of this. Over time, there was a shift from a dependence on indentured servitude to African slavery. Why did the shift happen? Well, one reason was that slaves' status would become forever. Once you're a indentured servant, has to go free after 4 to 7 years. A slave is your property forever, plus children. Any children that slave has is also your property, which creates a profit motive there. Slaves also had Africans also had a stronger immunity to malaria, which was a big problem in this region too, which also accounted for them supplanting indentured servitude. All right, so Virginia is a royal colony, which means it's run by a governor who's appointed by the monarch. It does have a legislature, though. This is split into two chambers, the House of Burgesses and the Governor's Council. The House of Burgesses is elected. The Governor's Council is a lifetime appointment appointed by the monarch. They also adopted England's county court system for local governments. So you can see this influence today. We still, like the House of Burgesses would be the rough equivalent to a state legislature or to Congress. We still have, of course, the county court system as well. Religion in Virginia. Official church in Virginia was the Church of England. All residents, if you live there, you're forced to pay taxes in order to support it. There was no freedom of religion. You had vestrymen whose job it was to enforce moral law, and they prosecuted moral offenses. Among moral offenses would be fornication and drunkenness. And on the books, there was a law which mandated the death penalty for Quakers. This may not have ever been enforced, but it was on the books. The leader of Virginia during some of this time was a guy named Thomas Dale. He was very extreme in religious matters, saw himself involved in a holy war, essentially, and his view was we have to enforce our religion within the boundaries of Virginia. So no freedom of religion yet in Virginia. To the north of Virginia, we have Maryland, and it was founded by Lord Baltimore. There are actually two Lord Baltimores, father and son. The father had a vision. The father was a English Catholic, and Catholics in England had been persecuted since Henry VIII had converted the country to Protestantism. So Lord Baltimore had a vision of creating an English colony that could be an outpost for Catholics, and it fell upon his son, the second Lord Baltimore, to actually do this. Second Lord Baltimore's name was George Calvert. He was a devout Catholic. He wanted a haven for Catholics in the New World. That on the one hand. On the other hand, he also wanted to cash in on the tobacco boom, which was going on in the Chesapeake region at the time. So he died before this could happen, and his son ultimately ended up carrying it out. He plans to make Maryland a Catholic colony, but of course Protestants want to make money just as much as Catholics do, so many Protestants ended up migrating here to try to cash in on the tobacco boom as well. So quickly, Catholicism became a minority religion in Maryland. Realizing this and realizing that this trend would probably continue, the authorities in Maryland went ahead and passed a law which is now called the Act, which was called the Act for Religious Toleration, or the Toleration Act of 1649. And what it did was it made Maryland the second colony in the New World after Rhode Island, who we'll talk about in a little bit, to affirm religious toleration. It was designed to protect Catholic minority from the Protestant majority. It's worth noting it did not establish complete freedom of religion. It protected only Christians who believed in the Trinity. It did not separate church and state. If you were not a Christian, you didn't have any protections under this. It did not succeed in securing religious freedom. It has ultimately only lasted 5 years. In 1654, it was repealed, and the Maryland legislature voted to take away Catholic voting rights. So it didn't succeed. So why are we talking about it? Answer is because it is one of the first significant steps towards religious toleration in the colonies. Yeah, it may not look like much by our standards in 2018, but, the Model T doesn't look like much by our standards in 2018 either. But certainly, without the Model T, we wouldn't have Rolls Royces or whatever car you want to hold up as the perfect car. This gives early American history, a religious liberty to draw from, and this would be expanded on later. This was one of the first steps at religious freedom, and they didn't get it right, but it was an attempt which made some progress. How often do you get something completely right the first time you try it? The answer is almost never. It takes trial and error, and this is one of the first trials. All right, so vast majority of immigrants who came to the Chesapeake region were indentured servants. So estimated about 90% of them were. And of these, about half of them would be worked to death, literally. Life expectancy in Chesapeake was pretty short. Men lived only on average about 48 years, women only about 44 years. Malaria and typhoid fever were the greatest killers. About 80% of those who migrated as indentured servants were men, about 20% were women. Women actually had maybe a better situation here than men did because they were so outnumbered by men that you get, let's put it this way, a buyer's market for widows and single women. There's a lot of men and not many women. That allows a woman to be more picky in who she chooses to marry. Oftentimes, women who are indentured servants would marry a wealthy man who would pay off her debt and thus basically free her from indentured servitude. Now, don't misunderstand this as me saying that life was good. It was unimaginably hard by our standards unimaginably hard by our standards today. Entire families were wiped out by epidemics. Infant mortality rate was probably between 1 in 2 and 1 in 3. Even by the standards of the 1600s, life was pretty brutal. The life expectancy, for example, in New England was on average about 20 years longer than what it was in Chesapeake. Again, because of the climate. This is an area where mosquitoes really flourish, and they spread diseases like malaria. And of course, heat also spreads typhoid fever. Really, we'll never forgive the Spanish for introducing mosquitoes to North America. All right, so Chesapeake Colony. Tobacco farms are the big deal, and of course it takes a lot of land to farm, so Chesapeake area is going to be sparsely populated. You have huge plantations. On average, you have about 6 people per square mile. So many settlers here were isolated. There's a tobacco boom, which lasts all throughout the 1620s, at least until 1629. Then we have the bust. As you probably know, economics bubble. When the price of something and the value of something starts shooting way up very fast, it usually comes back to reality at some point. And this is what happened in 1629 when the bubble burst and tobacco prices declined by 97%. So this broke a lot of people, lost profits, etc. It did remain profitable. More recent example might be, the housing boom, which the housing boom and bust in the early 2000s, 2008, the bubble burst and housing and property values declined precipitously, and a lot of people lost a lot of money. Housing and property is still profitable. It's just after it stabilized, tobacco remained profitable too, just not as profitable. It's no longer the get-rich-quick thing that it had been in the 1620s. Of course, the people hit hardest by this bust were the poor. The wealthy planters obviously saw hits in their profits, but they made this up typically by raising rent or charging higher interest rates on loans, which, of course, hurt the poor. Wealthy planters, we dominated the politics. They controlled commerce. They owned most of the land, and they were only a small minority. Vast majority of people in the Chesapeake lived in extreme poverty. Most people who left the old world came here to escape poverty, but most of them ended up finding it here as well. Third Anglo-Powhatan War, we won't talk about the second, but the third one happens because more and more white settlers are arriving in Virginia, and of course they're pushing farther and farther into Powhatan land, encroaching on their land. And they didn't respect Native American claims to land After 30 years of peace, a coalition of Native Americans decided to fight back against this encroachment, and they launched an attack and ultimately killed about 500 whites. At the time, the population of Virginia was only about 8,000, so 500 casualties is, 1/16 of the population of the colony, which 1 in 16 people dies. It's a safe bet that everybody knows at least one person, probably multiple people, who were killed. Settlers responded in kind, killed many Powhatans, ultimately defeat them, and they end up forcing them onto a specific area on which they're not allowed to leave. So they're confined to specific areas, which might sound very much like a reservation, which is coming later. What's the significance of this? Beginning of of reservations, although this was not called a reservation, the concept hadn't been invented yet. And this was a continuing escalation of Native American European conflict over lands and cultural clash. Not everybody, not all the colonists, though, felt that this confining the Powhatans and others to specified regions was going far enough. Some of them felt that that was going too soft on the Native Americans. A lot of colonists were also angry over Virginia Governor Berkeley and Maryland's Lord Baltimore because they controlled the trade with the Native Americans. They held a fur trading monopolies. And the sense was, among many colonists, they were left out, they were excluded. They wanted to get ahead in business too, but they couldn't because the governments of Virginia and Maryland were rigged against them. It was set up to reinforce the dominance of Berkeley, Baltimore, and their friends and cronies and the people at the top. Of course, this anger also gets fused with anger against Native Americans with whom they're trading and who have fought conflicts with colonists before. So its analogy would be something like, I don't know if I want to go there. All right, colonist and Native American relations continue to deteriorate. This poor whites, unable to find settled land, continue to squat on Native American lands. One group of Native Americans called the Doeg were angry about this. They were also angry that a settler had not paid them for some goods, so they raided his home and stole some hogs as payment. The colonists pursued them and killed them all, including other Native Americans who had nothing at all to do with the raid at all. So it deteriorates, so it's almost like a gang war. You kill one of our guys, we kill one of yours in retaliation. Governor Berkeley, who wants to maintain order, but he also doesn't want to destroy Native Americans because he's trading with them, proposes defending the frontier with a fort. So he wants to build forts along the frontier to protect them, protect the settlers. Both sides, both the Native Americans and the settlers, see their entire way of life as being under attack and threatened. And when people feel this way, they oftentimes will resort to horrific things they wouldn't normally do. Governor Berkeley's offer was considered quite generous by most of the colonists. Too generous, as in fact, many of the colonists said, why do we want to spend so much time and money building forts along the frontier and manning these forts along the frontier to protect us? There is a cheaper way to handle this, and that way is extermination. A lot of the colonists just wanted to go in and wipe out as many Native Americans as possible. That will settle the problem. This was a no-go for the people at the top because they were profiting from trade with them, but the people at the bottom were not profiting at all, so they saw no value. All right, so this anger at Native Americans and at the governments, which they perceived as rigged, continued to boil and ultimately blew up with an uprising, a popular uprising we now call Bacon's Rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon was a colonist who emerged as a leader of this movement favoring harsh treatment for Native Americans. He felt the government was too soft on Indians, so let's take matters into our own hands. And so he was elected by the colonists to lead a campaign against Native Americans in 1676. This was an open defiance of the colonial government, which was pursuing more peaceful relations with the Native Americans. Bacon and a large group of his men marched to the capital of Virginia, to Jamestown, and demanded authority from the governor to wage war on Native Americans. The governor, seeing a mob of hundreds, maybe thousands of men with pitchforks and torches on his doorstep, demanding authority to wage war on the Indians, decided he would like to continue living, so he granted the authority. And off they marched to the frontier to massacre as many Native Americans as they could. Once they were gone, the governor, Berkeley, realized this was going nowhere good, so he sent a courier out there to inform them that he had rescinded the authority to wage war. Bacon and his men then turned around, marched back to Jamestown, where they burned down the governor's residence, burned down the capital, and basically overthrew the government. So this is a rebellion against the government of Virginia. And towards that end, Bacon produced a pamphlet and called A Declaration of the People of Virginia, which he lays out a number of grievances against the state of Virginia. One was unfair taxes, one was cronyism, and one was they failed to protect colonists from Native Americans. Where is this going? It ultimately fails because Nathaniel Bacon, at the height of his power, dies of dysentery suddenly. And with him dead, his movement fizzles out. Berkeley is able to regain control. He captures many of Bacon's followers and has over 20 of them hanged for their role in this. Back in London, though, Berkeley is seen as having failed as governor. He was unable to maintain control of his colony, so he was recalled, in other words, fired as governor of Virginia and went home. He later got knighted, though, so don't feel too bad for him. And the rebellion fizzled out. It was unsuccessful. So what is this? Is this an early attempt at a revolution? Or is this an unlawful acts of a terrorist? Extermination or expansion of liberty? Maybe both. It's interesting that this happened in 1676, 100 years before the Revolution in 1776. One way to look at this is a forerunner to the American Revolution. Another way to look at it is a attempted genocide of Native Americans. Reality, it's probably to some extent both. All right, so indentured servitude is still a thing here, but as we get later and later into the 1600s, white servants, indentured servants began to become fewer and far between, and black slaves become more and more common. Slavery in 1660 is officially recognized and regulated. Maryland becomes the first colony to officially codify slavery as a lifelong inheritable social status. Before that, there was some question, some ambiguity on does slavery last forever? Are children of slaves as well? Maryland passes a law in 1661 which says slavery lasts forever, and any child of a slave is also a slave. 9 years later, in 1670, Virginia passes a similar law. And of course, this is going to lead to slavery becoming deeply entrenched in American society, particularly in the South. And by 1700, 80% of all laborers in the Chesapeake region are going to be slaves. More slaves are going to be imported directly from Africa. This works better, quote unquote, from a slave owner's perspective too, because where do you go if you're a runaway slave? Where do you go? You can't get back home. You can't blend in with white society. You could run and try to join the Native Americans. Maybe they would take you in. They might kill you, or they might return you to your master and collect a reward. So there's really nowhere for you to go. Of course, this also reinforces racism. There's always been sort of debate and chicken and the egg problem. Was slavery caused by racism, or was racism caused by slavery? Probably both at the same time. Going north again, let's go back to our buddies in New England. Puritanism is still going strong there. New England leaders built their colonies on religious and social ideals. At the time, we think of the South as being the Bible Belt today, but in these days, New England would have been considered the Bible Belt. New England also becomes the business, industry, and cultural sector of the New World and is much less agricultural based than the South as well. New England had its own regional identity, largely based on Puritanism. Slavery existed in New England, but did not catch on as much as it did in the South and was on a much smaller scale. So about City Upon a Hill. In 1629, a group of Puritans obtained a charter to colonize Massachusetts Bay north of Plymouth. And this was going to be a Puritan-dominated, self-governing colony. And in 1630, the Massachusetts Bay Company sent out 11 ships with 1,100 passengers under Governor John Winthrop. And Winthrop declared in an essay called A Model of Christian Charity that Massachusetts would be as a city on a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. His view was that this new colony they're forming in Massachusetts Bay would serve as a model to the rest of the world on good Christian government. This is going to be a colony where the rich will help the poor, where jealousy will be eliminated, where personal desires will be put aside in favor of higher law. So you can see, obviously, these are all Christian ideals. Massachusetts, he said, would be God's elect nation. Settlers are going to build a harmonious, godly community. Did this work out? Not perfectly. But do we still see this in our culture today? Absolutely. Ronald Reagan, over 200 years later, famously, 350 years later, famously gave a speech in which he defined America as a city upon a hill. We still see ourselves as like a shining light of freedom, right, to the rest of the world. And this is where that begins, with City Upon a Hill. Ultimately, this colony which is formed succeeds. The first year is the hardest, where about 30% of the colonists died, but after that it started to grow faster. Life is a little better there than it is farther south. There's very few indentured servants, very few slaves there. Voting, adult male church members are allowed to vote too, which provides for some form of self-government. Obviously, again, we're comparing to today, that's not much, but that was far. Where else in the world did people get to vote at that time? Most New Englanders belonged to the Church of England nominally, but their churches were mostly self-governing. It was broad-based with laymen, in other words, non-ministers, heavily involved in church affairs, deacons, elders, things like that. In other words, what we would think of today as Congregationists. There was a shortage of seminary-trained ministers in the New World at this time, so laymen and non-ministers, people who hadn't been formally trained, would have to take leadership roles, and this is something we still see in a lot of churches today, right? New England way, there was a fear, though, among some of the leaders, religious leaders, that independent congregations would eventually undermine Puritanism. In other words, if we have all these different churches all doing their own thing, they may come up with some wrong interpretations of the Bible, heresies, things like that. You might get crazy people. Some of them might decide that become Catholics, for instance, the Horror or Quakers or whatever. And so the New England way was a series of rules that was adopted by the religious leaders of the colonies, which strengthened the authority of the clergy. Education is going to be encouraged. We're going to establish universities. These universities are going to educate the ministers and the elite in New England. And the church must be free of state control, but not vice versa. So in other words, church is free, doesn't control the state. The state doesn't control the church, but the church controls the state. These universities established towards this end. The first university in what's now the United States to be founded was Harvard, which was founded in 1636. It was founded as a school to train ministers. Also, the state of Massachusetts the colony of Massachusetts passed the old Deluder-Satan Law of 1647, which was a precursor to what would become public education. The belief was the devil targets children, and the way to protect them from the devil is through education. Also, you have to be educated at least able to read, right? To be able to read the Bible and understand the Bible. So education is going to be encouraged towards this as well. Of course, Puritan society, a lot of people liked it. Not everybody did. Some people found it, of course, stuffy and restrictive. And one of the people who found it this way was a guy named Roger Williams. And Roger Williams was a seeker, what we would now call a seeker. He was open-minded, you could say, about religion. He was unsure about what he personally believed, but don't take being unsure with lacking interest. He was very interested in religion. He just had difficulty deciding what he personally believed. He holds a distinction, and of course, that's not popular in Massachusetts. Even less popular was he became an advocate for complete religious freedom and for a separation of church and state. He's the first great American to advocate for this. He argued against any connection at all between civil government and religion. He even went so far as to argue against swearing oaths on the Bible in court. His view was that by forcing religion on people, you're denying them the opportunity to actually have their own religion. In other words, if you force someone to do a good deed, you have denied them the opportunity to do a good deed. If I put a gun to your head and say, go help this person change their tire, you haven't really done a good deed. You've done it in a coercion. But if you see somebody that needs help and you help them voluntarily, then you've done a good deed. That's kind of the principle Williams is getting at here. He wasn't anti-religion by any means. He just felt that religion should be non-coercive. Of course, these ideas were very, very controversial in Massachusetts, and as a result of that, he was banished from the colony in 1636. No worries, he said. He moved south and started a new colony called Rhode Island, which was called Rogues Island by the Puritans. And this colony was based on the idea of total religious freedom, total separation of church and state. In Rhode Island, he also founded the First Baptist Church. You hear like First Church or whatever. This was maybe the First Baptist Church in America. Williams was also an advocate for fair dealings with Native Americans and a student of several Native American languages. So Roger Williams is sort of a early advocate, a guy who was probably way ahead of his time in advocating for religious freedom, and Rhode Island becomes the first colony in the New World to have complete religious freedom. Another person who got in trouble with the authorities in Massachusetts was a woman named Anne Hutchinson. And she was, by our standards today, we would consider her quite religious, but she had some ideas which ran afoul of the religious authorities in Massachusetts. At the time, the Massachusetts authorities insisted on good works. She argued that faith alone was what was needed. So it's sort of like, the Luther critique of the Catholic Church, although don't compare Puritans to Catholics. They won't like that at all. She argued that ministers were judging people based on works, which was them substituting their views for those of God. She also said that many, the clergy in Massachusetts, were not elect. In other words, elect means God's chosen people. This obviously is not going to be popular with the clergy. They denounced her and her followers as antinomians. What this means is they oppose the rule of law. Basically anarchists, the thinking being, if you don't have to do good works to be a good Christian, why would you do good works? This is a dangerous idea because Christians may stop doing good works, and this will collapse society if this catches on. She was also a woman, which violated the gender norms of the time, which made it worse in the eyes of the Puritan leaders. She started her own Bible studies, which were for women at first, where people would read scriptures and offer their own interpretations of it. And she encouraged everyone to read and come to their own interpretations of it. These meetings became so popular that men started attending as well, which she also welcomed, which also was controversial among the clergy in Massachusetts. Generally, she was a Puritan, but she had her ideas about the role of women were much ahead of her time. Ultimately, she was labeled a heretic and tried under Winthrop and banished from Massachusetts, but she ended up moving south to Rhode Island and settling there. Most important thing in New England, as you can probably gather from what we've said so far, is church. Church is the most important thing. At the center of each town was usually a church, which doubled as the town meeting house. All male taxpayers could participate in government. All were expected to be members of the church. Divorce existed. It was legally allowed for cases of bigamy, desertion, adultery, or physical cruelty, but it was extremely rare and was considered quite scandalous to get a divorce, particularly for a woman to get a divorce. Does the New England way, does Winthrop's social vision win out? The answer is not really. Economic and religious tension began to increase. The Puritans see themselves as God's chosen people. They should not concern themselves with matters of the world. They are not worldly. The problem is business and commerce are taking off in New England. This is not something a good Puritan should devote too much time to, because wealth is not important. What's important is doing God's work, right? But, I mean, get real. Most people want to be rich, so that as more and more business opportunities arise to make more money, this becomes more and more of a temptation to people in Puritan churches. Membership in churches began to decline. One reason for this is that only the children of church members were baptized. And if you want to be baptized into a Puritan church, you had to go before the congregation and ask and answer a series of very personal questions, including your sexual history. And keep in mind, I mean, if you lie, then obviously God's going to know. And if you want to join one of these churches, if you lie before God, then you might end up in hell. So you have to tell the truth. If you tell the truth, you're going to be revealing embarrassing information about it. By the way, this doesn't just mean that who you've slept with. I mean, you could never slept with anyone. So the questions will be things like, have you ever had lust in your heart? Well, and get real, if you're human, the answer is probably yes. Please explain this. You want to explain this in front of your parents? Probably not. So this weakens that, as does wealth. New England's vision of a Puritan society almost becomes a victim of its own success as people become more and more wealthy too. Native Americans, New England settlers at first had few problems with them. Many Native Americans were wiped out by diseases. 90% of all New England's coastal Native Americans were killed by epidemics. However, as more settlers arrived and expansion continued inward, this began encroaching more and more on Native American lands. Of course, Puritans thought that Native American religious beliefs were satanic, essentially, so they banned Native American religions. Instead, they encouraged Indians to convert to Christianity. Some did, most did not. And this obviously only creates more tension and makes things more tense between the two sides. One group of Native Americans called the Pequot had controlled the fur trade between Native Americans and the New Netherland colony, which is now New York. Pequot are more and more outraged as Europeans continue to encroach more and more on their territory, and they begin to fight back. Violence escalated until eventually Massachusetts and Connecticut come together to take military action, and this results in a brutal war. Hundreds of Pequots are killed as a result of this. English troops, in the end, surround the Pequot town of Mystic. They set it on fire, and anyone who tries to escape is shot. This includes several hundred women and children. And this crushes Pequot resistance, and that's pretty much the end of Pequot resistance. Most of them are exterminated. The few who survive are sold into slavery into the Caribbean. So another Native American group which has been essentially defeated. Another Native American war comes about as King Philip's War, named after a Native American leader named Metacom, whom the English called King Philip. And this was a result, again, of disputes over land. Native Americans refused to sell land and convert to Christianity, as the settlers wanted them to do. And the spark in the powder keg was when Plymouth hanged 3 Native Americans who killed a Indian who'd converted to Christianity. This results in Metacom, who's a very effective leader. He manages to pull together several Native American peoples in a coalition to resist the English. He's also in a much better position to fight back because this time Native Americans, through trades with the Dutch, had obtained guns and they knew how to use them. So firepower is going to be roughly equal this time around too. So this is much tougher war for the English to win. About 2/3 of, it's estimated, of Native Americans in New England ended up joining Metacom's side. Native American raiders attacked 52 English towns in New England, killed about 2,500 colonists, or 5% of the total colonial population. The tide turns against Metacom, though, in 1676 when the Mohawks and several Native Americans who had converted to Christianity end up turning against him. Ultimately, he is killed. His supporters, including his wife and child, that are sold into slavery into the West Indies. And what's the result of this? It's the end of active resistance to white settlement by Native Americans in New England. The southern New England population of Native Americans is reduced by about 40%. And there's not going to be any more overt resistance to colonial expansion in New England. So, okay. Salem witch trials. I know you've heard about this. One of the most infamous events in all American history. All right. Couple things we need to talk about. One, witch trials have been pretty common in Europe throughout the Middle Ages and would continue until the 1600s, a little bit even into the 1700s. Why did these people believe in witchcraft? We got to put life in perspective here. Life at this time was brutal. If there's a drought, your crops fail, you starve to death in winter. If you may give birth to 16 children, 9 of them may survive into adulthood. Your life expectancy is probably 60 years, maybe less. Epidemics come through and wipe out entire families, sometimes entire communities. You're in constant fear that Native Americans might attack and massacre your family. If you have any kind of health problem, there's nothing that can be done. You suffer it out. You either get better or you don't. You get to watch friends and family members suffer and die all the time. Life is brutal. Life is extremely brutal. Now, this is one of the reasons the Puritans believed so much in a vengeful God. It's easy to believe in a loving God when you have a pretty good life. If you were living under the conditions that most people at this time lived, you would not have seen much evidence of a loving God. Life is brutal, and that must be because God is vengeful. And, of course, in the Old Testament especially, God can be pretty vengeful sometimes. And Puritans and people in this era did not have access to the scientific knowledge we have today. They explained bad things that happened through what they did understand, and that was Christianity. They also didn't think of people individually to the extent we do now. This whole personal relationship with God, and God judges us individually. This owes a lot to the Enlightenment, which has not quite reached the colonies yet. And this time and before, people thought of themselves more as a member of a community. If one person in the community is sinning, he can screw it up for all of us. If we find somebody in our community who's offending God, we have to deal with it ourselves. If we don't deal with it, then God will deal with it with all of us, and that will not be good. So that's sort of the context from which the Salem witch trials occurred. 2 little girls, ages 9 and 11, named Betty Parris and Abigail Williams. They were the daughter and niece, respectively, of Samuel Parris. Were in 1691 and Samuel Parris, I should mention, was one of the ministers and leaders of Salem, were encouraging an African slave by the name of Tituba to tell their fortunes and talk about sorcery. And so what she did was she cracked an egg in a bowl, and if you looked into the yolk, it was supposed to tell you something about your future. Similar, this is like, games kids play, similar to like MASH or something like that, right? So one of them looked into it and thought she saw a coffin. Uh-oh, that's not good. And begins to freak out. Father Samuel Parris walks in, sees what's going on. The little girls know that they're not supposed to be doing this because protecting the future is a sin. So they freak out. They blame Tituba. They later began behaving strangely, and the villagers blame witchcraft for this. They are then pressed to identify their tormentors. They blame Tituba. They blame two extremely poor white women of low social status in Salem. More young girls, began accusing others of witchcraft. They start by accusing the outcasts, the poor, the people who don't attend church regularly, the people who are impoverished or mentally ill. But as time goes on, they began accusing people who were much higher prominence. 2/3 of the accusers were females aged 11 to 20, many of them orphans. So what you have here is people of very low social status maybe striking back against people of higher social status. Most people accused of witchcraft were prominent. 342 people got accused of witchcraft. Keep in mind, the colony had a population of 500, so we're talking almost 70%. Many of those who were accused were held in jail for days, many of them tortured, including a 4-year-old child who was tortured after being accused of witchcraft. Family members accused other family members. Ultimately, 50 people confessed to witchcraft and saved themselves. 20 refused to confess and were excommunicated and executed, plus one dog was executed for witchcraft. Being excommunicated may have cut worse than being executed, actually, because being excommunicated means you're not going to heaven. And, of course, religion was the most important thing in most of the people's lives at this time. Those who were executed, most of them were executed by hanging on Gallows Hill. After they were hanged, their bodies were left there to serve as an example till they decomposed and fell off. One man was crushed to death by rocks. This continued to escalate. These little girls would ride through town on a carriage and just randomly point at people in crowds and accuse them of witchcraft. Ultimately, by 1693, the governor's wife was accused of witchcraft, at which point the governor stepped in and said, maybe this has gone a little bit too far, and he called them out, and the hysteria began to decline at that point, and it ultimately went away. What really happened here? Did they really believe something was up? Maybe. I've heard theories about mold on bread caused it. Or it could just be they were evil people. I don't know. We really don't know. What we do know is that this helped end Puritanism in New England. If you're somebody outside of New England and you saw what's going on there, what would you think? These people are insane, right? That's what a lot of people outside of New England thought. And Puritanism, as a result of the Salem witch trials, went greatly into decline and would die out within 100 years or so. All right, slavery. More settlers swept into the West Indies, built sugar plantations there. 60% of the English settlers went to the Caribbean. They established sugar plantations. Of course, sugar plantations need a big workforce, so they buy slaves to do it. After the 1670s, they began moving to Carolina colony, and they began bringing their slaves there as well. They began to continue to grow sugar there, and they also grew rice in Carolina as well. And new slavery, which we talked about already continued. Slaves were used to work in rice paddies. This creates a slave-based economy, which will become a theme for the rest of the course. Native Americans were used as slaves sometimes too, But there were problems with this. A Native American, for example, could escape and return home. A slave who's been brought over from Africa cannot do that. So African slaves are more efficient than Native American slaves or indentured servants. In 1670, 200 white Barbadians and their slaves arrived near present-day Charleston and began colonizing. Rice becomes the staple crop of Carolina. White indentured servants usually didn't survive working in the rice paddies because of malaria, so they were replaced with African slaves. Just to give you some numbers to show how quickly the slave population grew. In 1680, slaves were about 17% of the population of Carolina. But by 1700, 20 years later, they became a majority of the population in Carolina. So you can see slavery really takes hold in those 20 years, and it's going to be over 150 years before it's wiped out. New Netherland colony, which is now New York, was one of the more diverse colonies. You had German immigrants, French, Scandinavian, Africans. You also had various religious groups, Protestants, Catholics, and some Jews, and even some Muslims settled there too. We need to talk about the Beaver Wars, also known as the Iroquois War, or the French and the Iroquois War, which was fought in the mid-1600s in the Great Lakes region. Beaver pelts became a huge export in this region of North America, became extremely profitable. The Iroquois, which was a coalition of several Native American groups led by the Mohawks, had become became a regional power in that area, and they sought to extend their trade network and monopolize the fur trade between the European markets and the tribes of Western Great Lakes region. They were encouraged to do this by the Dutch and by the English, who provided them with guns to give them more power. And of course, having guns gave them a huge advantage over other Native Americans. You can see this is the area under Iroquois hegemony. What that means is basically control or influence. The Iroquois encroached on pro-French Indians and quest for pelts and captives and brought them into their nation. This results in several bloody battles between 1648 and 1657. In these battles, the Iroquois defeat the Hurons and other tribes. They also attack some French settlements. This is considered one of the bloodiest conflicts in the history of North America. Since the Iroquois had guns, they were able to not only defeat their other Native American enemies, but they were also devastated the beaver population. Hunting beavers with guns is much easier than bows and arrows or spears, and once the beaver population was decimated in one region, the Iroquois were pushed farther west into other Native Americans' territory, which put them in conflict with them as well. The Dutch continued to encourage this as it led to more pelts being sold to them and more money for them. The Iroquois centralized government to more effectively fight their war. Eventually, the Iroquois ended up controlling most of the Indians in the region and became a regional power in the Great Lakes region. This went on actually technically until 1701 when the Great Peace of Montreal was signed. So from this, the Beaver Wars, the Iroquois emerged as one of the probably strongest Native American power in North America. You know, the Swedes also set up a colony in the New World. It was pretty small, though. It was in the Delaware Valley, and it traded furs. Ultimately, New Netherland annexed it in 1665. It would probably be forgotten today if it hadn't introduced the log cabin to the New World. This was a very common style of house in Sweden, and it caught on here too. And of course, you really associate log cabins with North America. Dutch settlements were taken over by England in 1644. The Dutch colonists who defected and supported the English were rewarded for it. They were given large land grants and estates. Need to talk about the middle colonies here, last middle colonies here too. It's going to be Pennsylvania. 1681, this was a colony founded by William Penn as a holy experiment, which was based on the teachings of George Fox. And it was a Quaker colony. Quakers, you might know, are more officially known as the Society of Friends. Quaker is a derisive name that stuck. The Quakers, like the Puritans, were considered a fringe religion back in England, so they wanted to establish a colony here where they could practice their religion freely. Quakers believed in radical equality. In fact, they believed in equality so much they didn't even believe in ministers. In fact, their churches didn't have ministers at all. Everybody was considered a minister. Quaker referred to like the emotional style of worship that you had at those churches. In Society of Friends churches, congregants would come and sit down and wait till they felt moved by the Spirit to say something. The Quakers, though, were extremely, because they believed in total equality, they were very tolerant of other religions. They welcomed other religions, other people of other religions to settle in Pennsylvania, which made them, along with Rhode Island, one of the few colonies to allow religious toleration. They were egalitarian. They saw the rich and the poor as equals. They were pacifists. They didn't believe in violence, and they refused to swear oaths. Pennsylvania became a majority Quaker colony, but also many Catholics, Presbyterians, Baptists, and radical sectarians, radical religions moved there as well too, because they were tolerated there and allowed to practice their religion. So probably hear Quaker today, you think of Quaker Oats, right? Fun fact: Friendsville out in Blount County was named Friends because it was a Friendsville because it was a Quaker settlement early in the 1700s, I believe. So that's interesting. If you get a chance, there was also a stop on the Underground Railroad there. We'll talk about that later on in the course. The Quakers were also one of the first religious groups to oppose slavery, because if you believe in total equality, slavery doesn't really work, right? Last but not least, France and Spain, although they do not control much of what's now the United States, France does continue to colonize Canada, and Spain continues to control much of what's now the U.S. Southwest, as well as the colony of Florida. And that's going to be all for today. If you have any questions at all, as always, please let me know. I'll be happy to answer them for you. Don't forget to complete your assignments for this module, and I will see you next time. Have a good day.